Hello everyone, my name is Sinow and welcome to a Lost Ark Class guide in order to assist you in picking your main out of the 15 subclasses that are available to us here in the West for Lost Ark's launch. You might find it's a little bit difficult to choose between all of these classes in the game, and in order to assist you, I've given you a few pros and cons about the class that you might want to look out for if you decide to play it into the end game. I wanted to make a video in particular for people like myself who you want a little bit more information than just the very basics and like the flashy videos and the cool character art on the official website, but you aren't quite at the point where you want to listen to a guy talk about his tripod setup for 35 minutes in front of like a statistics screen. You're maybe not quite at that level of being through the looking glass, and for people like yourselves who want a little bit of information about the meta and things to look out for when you choose a certain class, this video is hopefully going to be very helpful for you. So let's dive right into it. Starting off with the warrior and its subclasses because it's the first on the official website, and we have the Berserker. The Berserker is your guy if you just want to go big man beast, big guy, big armor, big sword, and you want to do big DPS. This is the class for you. It is very easy to understand. One of the pros for this class. Basically, all you do is you build up your identity gauge, and then when it's full, you enter sicko mode and you move faster and you do more damage and you crit more. And that's basically the class in a nutshell. It's nice and easy to understand in that regards, and it does quite a lot of nice consistent damage. You can even make the burst mode, I think it's called burst mode, the mode that you enter when you fill up your identity gauge and then you get the buff. I don't know, trying to keep up with all of this different terminology for the same things between the Korean version, the Russian version, and our version of the game is giving me a headache. When you enter that mode, you do a lot more damage, and through certain kinds of gearing, you can eventually make it so that you enter burst mode much more consistently, basically quasi-permanently, which is a pretty cool thing to eventually achieve on this class as you gear up in the future, and that feels great to play. As a con for this class, however, when you don't have your burst mode enabled, it can feel a little bit sluggish and slow. Some of its attack animations can be a little bit on the slow side, and you do need to be careful on bosses to not get caught out. Perhaps if you're trying to do an attack and it locks you in position and then you get hit by something, especially until you get a little bit more used to it. Another con for this class is that its cooldowns can be quite long, so if you're the type of person who likes to use your cooldowns a lot to kind of move around and do different abilities, you might find that sometimes with the Berserker you're kind of sitting there waiting for certain cooldowns to come back up, so it might not suit everyone in that regard. But overall, the Berserker is a really solid class, and it can be quite a lot of fun to play if you want something a bit more on the simple side, but also feels quite satisfying when you get good at it. Next up is the Paladin. So this game has two support classes in our version of the game that's coming to the West, Paladin and Bard, and these are the classes that sacrifice a little bit of their damage in order to provide healing and supportive buffs to the party. As a result, one of the pros for Paladin is that you will pretty much always be desired by parties as a support class. They are kind of the most in-demand class that most groups want all the time, and you will find that if you like being popular, you want to be prom king or prom queen, then you will want to play Paladin or Bard, and this allows you to get into groups basically very quickly. So one of the nice things about the Paladin is, unlike some of the Bard skills, because a lot of the Paladin support skills are an aura, it means it's quite easy to just use them while you're doing your own thing. You don't really miss your allies very much if you have like a big aura around yourself. It's more kind of part of your kit, so to speak, than the Bard that has to specifically decide when to use their abilities more, and that makes it quite easy to keep up the support side of things without like maybe missing your allies or whatever. So it's quite easy in that regard, and generally is a pretty easy class overall. The cons for Paladin is that it doesn't maybe provide quite as much shielding as Bard does. In particular, the Bard can use their identity gauge to do a big shield buff on the party. The Paladin doesn't have quite as much of that in its kit. It has more of a kind of gradual heal kind of vibe to it, but overall, they're both good at support anyway, and I wouldn't worry too much about that if you do decide to play Paladin, but you might find that the kind of big flashy moments where you put a massive shield on everyone are a little bit more kind of Bard's forte compared to the Paladin. Another thing about Paladin that is a con is that in order to really unlock the full potential of its support, you really need to get 3 engravings to their fullest. If you don't know what an engraving is, it's kind of like a passive buff that you need to achieve through kind of gearing, where you get a certain stat up to its maximum and then it unlocks like a passive. For the Paladin to really achieve in particular its healing at full capacity, you need 3 of these at full, which takes a little bit of gearing, a little bit of time to get. So you might find that your support abilities aren't quite at full power when you first are gearing up your Paladin at endgame, but you'll get there eventually. Don't worry about it. And when you do, Paladin will be a very satisfying, easy, effective support to play, and you will get lots of parties and groups for it. So absolutely would recommend playing this class if you fancy kind of a support that also has like some cool magic abilities and some kind of cool sword abilities too. Moving on to the final warrior subclass for us in the West, we are talking about the Gunlancer. So the Gunlancer is the closest class in this game to a traditional tank. However, Lost Ark doesn't have the trinity of tank, healer, DPS, so it is important to stress here that you are not a tank necessarily. You are a DPS class. You just happen to be a DPS class that does tons of damage and is really tanky and has really good synergy. So, you know, nice and balanced. You basically have loads of everything almost, apart from maybe mobility, but we'll talk about that in a second. One of the big pros for the Gunlancer class is that it has a unique taunt ability, and this allows you to make the boss attack you in particular for a couple of seconds. And with the way Lost Ark works, a lot of the time in between big certain boss mechanics that happen at certain parts of the boss's health bars, it does kind of random patterns of attacks that can have like kind of big AoE effects where you have to dodge in a certain way. There's a lot of RNG to this, and it keeps the combat feeling very kind of exciting and dynamic in Lost Ark. But one thing that Gunlancer can do is use a taunt ability to kind of like snap the boss out of a certain pattern it might be doing for a couple of seconds, and this can be very, very nice for certain groups. It helps make certain mechanics on certain fights a lot easier, and this is a unique thing that only Gunlancer can do in our version of the game. So if you want like that kind of cool moment where everybody knows that you've done something really cool, you might want to try out Gunlancer for that ability. And another plus for this class is, like I mentioned earlier, you're really tanky, so you don't die very easily to, like, you know, getting clipped by a boss ability, and you have really good DPS, and you have nice party synergy where you can help give people kind of like more defense and shields and stuff like that. You're just generally a really like fucking cracked class, frankly, to be honest with you. You bring a lot to groups, and for these reasons, groups will usually quite like having a Gunlancer in them as well, so very popular, and you do good DPS. The cons for this class are, like I said earlier again, it's not a tank. So I know some of you maybe quite like being the tank in traditional MMO games with the Holy Trinity. You just aren't, I'm afraid. It doesn't really work like that in Lost Ark, and I know that for some people that might put you off of playing Gunlancer. Sorry, but that's just the way things are. Another reason why you might not like Gunlancer so much is it is quite a stiff class to play. For instance, its dodge ability is a backstep, just like in, you know, Monster Hunter. It is a backstep that you have for a dodge that is a little kind of weird to play around, and the class can feel a bit stiff with its abilities. It doesn't have the most mobility, and that's maybe the big weakness of it. So if you're the type of person who likes really fast classes that can zip around the arena a lot, you might find that Gunlancer just isn't really for you. But overall, great class. Would recommend Gunlancer if you like being big tanky boy. Go for it. So moving on to the martial artists. God, there's a lot of martial artist classes in this game, by the way. We will start off with the Striker. So the Striker is a gender unlock class that has been added to the Korean version of the game more recently. What this essentially means is that they've started to go through a process where they take certain classes and then give them a different gender version that is slightly different. So for instance, the Striker is the male equivalent of what was originally the Wardancer. The Striker is like Wardancer. The base gameplay is that you build up combo points and then you use these combo points to do certain abilities. The pros in particular for the Striker is, first of all, not only does it look cool with its abilities, the punching and lots of really cool kind of slide kicks and stuff, if you buy the Founders Pack skin for this class, you do get to look like Ryu from Street Fighter. I know that alone is going to get a couple of you guys to say that this is your main, and you know what? By all means, because that is pretty neat that you can look like Ryu from Street Fighter. So if that's your bag and you really love that traditional kind of martial artist look to your character, then Striker is the class for you. Another pro of this class is that you can actually do quite a lot of damage with it if you can pull it off. So I will talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but Striker can be a bit tricky, but it does have a really high, not only like a kind of skill ceiling, but also DPS ceiling. You can do like really big numbers if you are proficient at playing this class, and it might be your kind of bag in that regard. So the cons for Striker is that it can be a little bit slow. In particular, the meta build for Striker doesn't really put a lot of points into, we call it agility. It might change when they might call it like swiftness in the Western version of the game. I don't know. All right, we'll find out when it comes out. But there's a stat that you can put points into that makes your character like do faster animations. And for the striker, putting points into that stat isn't very meta at the moment, so it can feel a little bit slow, the striker, in that regard. And another con to this class is that not only is it a little bit slow, but it has a lot of back attacks required in order to get the most damage out of your skills and abilities. So for those reasons, I think Striker can be quite difficult to play. It's not the easiest perhaps overall. So if you're the kind of person that you like the challenge, kind of showing off how good you are, this might be a good class for you to try and pick up because it is maybe not the easiest in that regard. But if you're the type of person that maybe doesn't want to have to struggle so much with a melee class that needs back attacks and can occasionally be a little bit slow at times, then don't pick Striker because it's going to be an uphill struggle in that regard. Moving on to the Wardancer, which is the original female class that Striker was based on. The Wardancer in particular, same playstyle as Striker where you build up combo points and then you use them for certain attacks. The Wardancer has really good party synergy buffs, including an 18% crit buff for the group. For these reasons, it's quite nice to have one of these classes in the group. You'll probably feel that your numbers are a lot more chunky if you have a good Wardancer. They can give you movement speed buff and crit buff, and it's really cool actually that although it's a damage dealing class that does good damage, it also has quite a lot of support in that regard as part of its kit just naturally. Another pro for this class is that it has quite a few different builds that you can go. There's actually quite a lot of build variety, so if you're the kind of person that likes to sort of try out different builds and see which one really works for you, the Wardancer has a lot of these in like the Korean leaderboards and stuff, lots of different styles of play. The cons for this class is that in between your skills, you do have to auto attack, so there's quite a lot of classes in this game that just use their skills constantly and you very rarely have to auto attack. Unfortunately, Wardancer is not one of them. You will have to auto attack between abilities, which can kind of be a bit of a down tempo moment in between, you know, the more exciting moments where you use your big attacks, etc. Another con of this class is that it has really good like burst damage windows, but if you miss your burst damage, then you will feel a little bit like you've wasted your time. So you need to be a bit careful to try not to get a little too hype and then whiff all of your burst damage and then you feel like a potato that has a crit buff at least, but still by all means a potato when it comes to damage. So bear in mind that it may be a little frustrating if you miss your abilities, especially because in later boss fights in this game, the bosses move around like they're cracked, man. They like warp around and they have like random attack patterns and they're super fast, and they also have like big AoEs, so it can be a little frustrating to miss sometimes in this game. Right, moving on to the Scrapper. So the Scrapper is another martial artist class, a little bit like Wardancer, but it is a bit more kind of close range class, I would say. It's got a very kind of nice 2 gauge sort of identity where you have a yellow gauge and a green gauge, and the yellow gauge abilities tend to be a bit more kind of faster paced, and the green gauge abilities tend to have a bit of a cast time but do really good damage. Again, I don't know what the names for these are in the West just yet, but I mean, if you play this class, you'll get used to it in like 5 seconds. Yellow abilities and green abilities. When you use the yellow ones, it gives you some green gauge. When you use the green ones, it gives you some yellow gauge, and then you go back and forth between them. So that's quite a cool little kind of playstyle, maybe like a balanced druid or a red mage, depending on what MMO you've played before in the past. One of the pros for this class is that it's actually quite tanky, and it has 2 dashes and good utility. So it's quite new player friendly, I would say. If you maybe make a positioning mistake or you get caught in an animation and you're like, uh-oh, time for me to bounce, you have a lot of dashing and also a little bit of tankiness. It also has a nice sense of movement with the dashes. And another pro of this class is that in particular it does really good kind of stagger or impairment damage. So for certain kind of boss mechanics, they will enter a mode where you need to stun them enough to like break them out of doing a big attack or whatever, and some of these boss abilities, they will wipe the group if you don't do enough stagger damage, which is different from normal damage. And the Scrapper is really, really good at this, in fact, and does really high stagger damage that allows you to get past these kind of like, almost, it's kind of like a damage skill check window, but you're doing a specific kind of damage, and if you don't have enough, a lot of the time you wipe. But Scrapper is really good for making sure that you can get past these like tight windows. So for that reason, that's another pro for Scrapper in the game. The cons, I would say, are it can be a little simplistic to play. It depends on your tastes. Some Scrapper play styles can be a little bit like you buff yourself up, you debuff the enemy, and then you punch it. And you do that over and over and over. Some people in particular for the Taijutsu playstyle, which focuses on the yellow skills more, maybe will find it a bit simple to play at times. Another con for this class is that it is very close range. It's very, very much melee only, and some of the shock skills, the green ones, ones have cast times to them, so if you don't like that for whatever reason, then this isn't really the class for you. So yeah, the Korean devs have actually gone on record to say that the Scrapper is kind of like the baseline when it comes to how they decide to balance classes in the games in terms of like relative power levels. They use the Scrapper as an example of a very well balanced, good class. Okay, finally we're moving on to the Soulfist, which is maybe the most esoteric playstyle of the martial arts classes. So one of the pros of Soulfist is if you want to play a character that feels like you're in Dragon Ball, then go no further, my friend. You might as well pause the video here because you have found your main and you are a Soulfist main. Congratulations. You managed to pick your main in record time. Very impressive indeed. The Soulfist feels like a Dragon Ball character because it has a nice mixture of martial arts abilities and also ranged abilities that are all about using kind of like energy. So it has like energy beams and like a big spirit bomb attack and stuff like that, and it's kind of a cool mixture of melee and a little bit of range. It also has a 3-tier identity kind of gauge where you get to a certain level of, I think it's called hype. They gave it a really weird name in the West. I'm pretty sure they called it hype. You basically go through 3 levels of hype, and as you do, you get more energy regeneration, and you get a little bit faster with your attacks and things like that, which again is a little bit like going Super Saiyan, so even more Dragon Ball comparisons to be made here. One of the pros for the class, of course, being that you can be like a Dragon Ball character. Another pro for this class is that it has the single hardest hitting ability in the entire game. It has a big spirit bomb that takes like a ridiculous amount of time to charge up and hit. It's like 6 seconds or something. But when you do hit this ability, you will see a really big number coming out of the enemies. And in particular, if you crit this ability, boom, straight up to the top of the MVP charts when it comes to damage. You have done it. It's really satisfying if you like to have one big ability that does a lot of damage. This is the class for you because it's got the big boom. Conversely, as a con, if you use this ability and then you miss it, or you maybe don't get the crit on it, it can be very frustrating to not get your full damage potential because of one ability, and you will be fishing for crits in this ability, and if you don't get it, you might find that you don't get MVP for damage done because of what is essentially RNG, so that can be a little frustrating. If you don't like that RNG aspect on your character or your class, this probably isn't for you, because Soulfist is all about that one big ability. Yes, it does do okay damage otherwise, but maybe not as much as other classes because it has such a really big hitting singular ability. Another con for this class is that it has a tiered power identity gauge, the hype that I was talking about earlier, and for this reason, you might feel like you're a little bit more kind of sluggish when you don't have tier 3 hype, you know? So some people, they might want to have a character that kind of goes fast all the time and is constantly using abilities, whereas with the Soulfist, you have to kind of build up to tier 3 with your hype meter. So for some people, that's maybe not their bag. It's not a huge con for me though, to be honest, but you are a little bit sluggish when you're at level 1. The Gunners. So first of all, I will cover the Gunslinger and Deadeye. The Gunslinger is the female equivalent of the Deadeye. It is the other gender unlocked class that's currently in Lost Ark. Both of these classes use a system where you switch between dual pistols, a shotgun, and a rifle in order to do different types of attacks from different ranges. And because they have this kind of rotating gun mechanic system, they do have a lot of abilities, more than classes do have on average normally, but for that reason, both of them are considered quite high APM classes. You need to input and switch between your guns quite a lot in order to move around the battlefield and do lots of damage. So for some people, they will love that, and for other people, I would say they might find that a bit exhausting, but I'll get to that in a second. First of all, let's talk about the Gunslinger. One of the pros for this class is that you just look really cool. I don't care what anybody says, I think this class is one of the coolest classes in the game, and I'm sure many people would agree. You're like this kind of cool, sexy, badass lady, kind of like a cowboy, you know? You just look great as the Gunslinger. It's a very flashy class for people who like to show off a little bit. You have a lot of cool movement abilities that allow you to sort of flip around the arena and then shoot people from far away with your rifle, and overall I think it's going to be a popular class, partially because the aesthetics of it are just so on point, in my opinion anyway. Another pro of this class is that you are capable of doing particularly good damage in the group. You can get MVP quite a lot if you play really well, and the Gunslinger compared to the Deadeye has more of her damage on her rifle abilities, and these rifle abilities don't really have positionals on them, and they can be done from quite far away from the enemy, the boss that you're fighting, which means that she's a little bit on the safer side compared to the Deadeye when it comes to doing her damage, and she can stay further away when things get a little bit tough compared to her male counterpart. Cons for the Gunslinger are, like the Deadeye, she can be very squishy. These classes are prime candidates for using up all of your resurrections when you're trying to do a boss fight, and a lot of these, for instance Guardian Rage, you only get to resurrect 3 times collectively as a group before you have failed and you have to restart the fight all over again. Gunslingers and Deadeyes have a lot of movement on their pistol skills, and the reason why they have a lot of movement on their pistol skills is because they must maintain a pretty almost perfect dodge ratio for boss AoEs so as to not get one shot. So both of these classes I would say can be quite difficult. Deadeye, by comparison to the Gunslinger, also is a very flashy class, also looks super cool, and it also does great damage. Theoretically, the Deadeye can do amazing damage actually, but the Deadeye has a fundamental flaw in its character design that the Gunslinger doesn't really suffer from so much. And it's that the Deadeye has more of an emphasis on his shotgun skills for doing damage, and these shotgun skills only have their full potential when it comes to doing damage unlocked if you get back attacks on the mob that you're fighting. This can be a problem because you are a very squishy class as well, so if you go into melee range, because the shotgun is a short range weapon, and you're trying to get behind the boss mob and then you get accidentally clipped by something, you take a lot of damage, and for this reason I would say Deadeye is slightly more difficult to play than Gunslinger because you do have a potentially really high level of punishment for maybe not being able to get behind the mob to do your damage correctly, and if you do get into melee range and get behind the mob, you might get hit by something and then die, which isn't great. So Deadeye, although theoretically can probably do slightly more damage than Gunslinger, you will find a lot of Deadeye struggle to be able to top the charts unless they're really, really good, because they do struggle a bit with this kind of this shotgun mechanic. However, one of the pros for Deadeye is that it does have a handgunner only spec where you only use the handgun abilities. This was quite recently buffed in Korea because it was considered very off meta, not as strong, and I think overall in terms of damage, the handgunner spec is probably not designed to do quite as much as the more difficult 3-gun spec. However, it is an option if you want to only use the handguns as one of these classes, and it does quite a lot of damage all things considered. It's a lot easier and safer to play, and it feels more like a sort of traditional class where you don't really have the gun switching mechanic, you only use the pistol skills, which have a nice amount of movement attached to them anyway. Alright, moving on to the Artillerist, which is my chosen main class for when the game comes out. I was really surprised by how much I like this class actually, because I tend to like faster classes with a lot of movement when I play RPGs, and I really didn't expect to like a class that's all about kind of stationary bombardment, choosing where to like fire something down and then a few seconds later it lands and then explodes, and having to really think about where the boss is so that you can do these like kind of powerful strike moves. I didn't really expect it to be so satisfying to play, but I really genuinely love it. Another reason why I like Artillerist so much is that it's widely considered to be a very solid class. It offers, for instance, a lot of impairment and destruction damage for passing those impairment and destructions DPS checks, which can be quite tight and punishing if you don't have certain classes in your composition. Artillerist is great for these, by the way. It also has a lot of nice synergy abilities. For instance, you can make the enemy's defense go down by 12%. You could also make it so that they have a 20% boost to stagger damage that they're taking, and overall Artillerist just has a really nice mixture of quite good DPS, it has a lot of utility to offer to the group, it has the ability to put shields in itself and it's tanky so it doesn't take too much damage too quickly. Overall, just like a really solid class, which is quite rarely played actually in Korea. It's kind of maybe got like an underdog vibe about it, so if you like to go an underdog class, you might want to consider something like Deadeye or Artillerist, as both of them tend to be on the lower side when it comes to player pick rate. The cons of Artillerist is that because you are quite well rounded in a lot of regards, you don't really tend to get MVP at the results screen at the end of a fight for damage being done overall. You might find that if you want to do the really big numbers, Artillerist is maybe surprisingly not actually that type of class. And another con of this class is kind of related to that point. The Artillerist is actually more of a kind of rotational class. It's more about using your abilities in a rotation and trying to predict where the enemy will move so that you hit them correctly, as opposed to a class that has like really large hitting abilities. So you might think Artillerist is about like firing off like a powerful like massive explosion ability and doing tons of damage with one skill. It's actually not really like that. It's more of a kind of consistent rotation of abilities that you use, and if you want that kind of massive number like endorphin release in your brain, you might find something like Soulfist Soulfist is a little bit more your bag, or maybe another high DPS class like Gunslinger. And moving on finally to the Sharpshooter. The Sharpshooter is your archetypal bow and arrow class that also has a hawk pet that it can use to assist it in certain abilities. It used to be called Hawkeye in Korea, but they've changed it to Sharpshooter for the Western version of the game. Maybe because they don't want Marvel's lawyers banging down the door over at the Lost Ark HQ. I don't know, that's maybe just speculation on my part, but better to be safe than sorry when it comes to Marvel's lawyers probably, huh? The pros of Sharpshooter are it's very easy to play, it's pretty straightforward, you don't have a lot of complicated abilities, you don't really like run out of mana necessarily or have really long cooldowns, and you have quite a lot of movement as well, so it's a really easy class to play. And another thing that's a pro about this class is that it has quite a lot of charge attacks where I think at least 2 skills are commonly used where you charge up your bow for a couple of seconds and release it, which does quite a lot of damage. So if you really like that feeling of charging up for a big hit and like waiting for your time to strike and then seeing those big numbers come out of the mob, Sharpshooter definitely offers that type of gameplay for you, and I did find it quite satisfying myself when I managed to get off like a really like well-timed snipe ability to do lots of damage to the boss that I was fighting. The cons for this class is that it's a little simple. It's mostly just kind of using your arrow abilities to do damage and build up your hawk gauge, with some of your skills being more for maneuverability and movement than necessarily doing damage. And then eventually when your gauge is full, you summon a hawk that gives everybody a very mild speed buff, and then you can either use your hawk to attack the enemy, or you can yeet the bird at the enemy and it explodes. And in one build for this class, it basically gets like a buff after you yeet the bird immediately to explode it. So it's maybe a bit basic. Some people maybe might find the rotation almost a bit boring if you're the type of person that likes more of a challenge. And I would say that the identity gauge ability where you summon the hawk, although I think the burb is very cute and all, it's perhaps a little underwhelming. It could be a bit more of a kind of crescendo moment in terms of class design. You just kind of summon this hawk, it sits there, it occasionally auto attacks and makes little bird noises, and then you eventually yeet it and it does a little bit of damage, and then you kind of reset. Maybe not the most exciting, but it's a very reliable class that has seen itself get a lot of buffs recently in Korea, where for a long time in Korea this was considered a very low DPS meme class. They buffed the hell out of it, and now it's considered a pretty reliable range DPS that can avoid a lot of mechanics, has a lot of movement, and is a pretty good damage dealer overall if you want something a little bit on the easier side. Moving on to the mages, a bit of a short segment this one, as there are only 2 mage subclasses, as for some bizarre reason they decided to get rid of Summoner when they were replacing it with Sorceress. Hard luck on that one, Summoners. Maybe more luck next time. Ugh, sorry about that one, but regardless, 2 pretty good classes here. We'll start off with the Bard. As I mentioned earlier when talking about the Paladin, the Bard is the other support class in Lost Ark, and it, like the Paladin, has a lot of shielding and healing it can provide to the group, as well as being able to debuff the mob that you're currently fighting so it takes more damage, and generally just being a very important and useful role to play inside a group. And for this reason, as a support class, you will pretty much always find yourself getting invites to groups. People need support classes, and there's only 2 of them, and there's loads of DPS classes, so for that reason you will find that if you want to be popular, Bard is a great choice to pick up. It also, as another pro, is a little bit better at providing like kind of big bursty shields on your group. So if you're idiot DPS who can't seem to dodge a single AoE do get hit, because of the big shielding that you provide, they're much more likely to be able to take a few hits without immediately using up one of your precious resurrections and making it so that you don't wipe. So for that reason, Bard also, as another pro, is pretty good in particular at progging new fights. It's very good at making it so that if people make mistakes they don't get punished as much, and overall it's just an incredibly important class in this game's meta. So we're going to need a lot of Bards and Paladins, and hopefully a lot of people will decide to pick this up, and if you do, hopefully you shall be rewarded. Cons for this class include that it's a little bit more targeted when it comes to its support abilities compared to the Paladin. There are more abilities where you have to put like a circle AoE on the ground in a specific position, and then people have to go and stand in it. So for that reason, you do have to sort of pay attention a little bit more to where you're putting your support abilities so that your teammates can actually tag them and get the benefit. This can be annoying if your teammates decide to just go to Narnia for no reason whenever it is an AoE, and it can be a bit frustrating if you don't have the ability to communicate with your group. So bear that one in mind. You might find Paladin is more your cup of tea if that type of stuff annoys you a lot. Another thing that can be a bit annoying about Bard, this is more of a kind of personal take, the constant discordant harp sounds. from a lot of your attack abilities where you play the harp incorrectly in order to, like, I don't know, damage the ears of the monster you're fighting. It can be a little annoying. You might find yourself wanting to lower the sound effect volume level after a while if you play Bard a lot, because the constant bring, bring, bring can be a little bit much, and it can be a bit annoying. Another little con as well, quickly, is that if you are playing a Bard or a Paladin, you do a little bit less damage overall compared to other classes, so you might find that sometimes if you're trying to solo things, it is taking you a little bit longer because you don't have as much damage. But that's not a huge problem overall. You still can do a fair amount of damage, and I mean, if you have a friend to help you out occasionally, you probably won't even notice it anyway. But overall, Bard is like quintessentially important class, and absolutely would encourage people to play it. Next up is the Sorceress. The Sorceress I don't have very much kind of hands-on experience with, because this is the newest class that they've added to the game. Well, actually, they've added another one called Painter now, because the devs for this game just do not stop. They are rapid fire when it comes to adding things to this game, which is great. But Sorceress is one of the newest classes that they've added, and it has two very cool playstyles, one of which is a slightly more kind of bursty playstyle, and the other one is a more kind of consistent DPS one. So the bursty playstyle has more kind of like cast times, a little bit more like a sort of traditional caster class, maybe a little bit like the Artillerist, in that it is very squishy, but if you place your attacks correctly, your spells, and you get the cast times down, then you will be able to do tons of damage. Whereas the slightly more consistent DPS spec is a little bit like playing piano. You use your skills a lot and you kind of fire off these abilities over and over and over to do consistent DPS. So that's pretty cool. One of the pros is that you can either be bursty or consistent DPS. It's up to you and how you want to play. And another pro of this class is that it has a very, very cool overall kind of visual effects thing going on, because it's one of the newest classes. There's lots of meteor storms and cool icicle spears. Again, maybe a bit of a personal comment this one, but I just think it looks and feels great, you know, when you're like hitting things with your spells. I just think it looks amazing, so that's also a pro if you like the really kind of flashy mage side of things. Cons for this class are, like I said, it is your quintessential glass cannon type class. If you get hit by AoEs, there's a very good chance that you're going to take tons of damage and you might die and find that a little bit more difficult compared to some of the tankier classes in this game. And as I said before, the consistent DPS style requires a lot of kind of APM, a lot of inputs for different spells. So you might find that a little bit exhausting if that's not your kind of style. But luckily, because the Sorceress has another way of playing with longer cast times, if you don't find that you want to play concert pianist with your keyboard, you can go for the slightly slower gameplay style and still do great damage. And this is overall a really, really good class that they've added to the game, and I'm sure it's going to be popular on the Western release. And finally, we have the Assassin archetype with the two subclasses that will be available to us here in the West when the game comes out. We have Deathblade, which is more of a kind of duelist archetype, and then we have Shadowhunter, which is more of a kind of edgy demon archetype. So starting off with the Shadowhunter, one of the pros of this class is that it just looks so cool. When you transform into a demon and all your attacks are really fast and all of these like cool red like visceral claw attacks and things like that, I just think this class looks great, and I actually think that it will be one of my first alt classes when the game comes out here very, very shortly. Another pro for this class is that a lot of these abilities that the Shadowhunter has, they have a little bit of range to them and they fire out quite quickly. So this is really nice because it allows you to maneuver around the boss and then fire out abilities quite fast without getting caught in an animation that might end up getting you hit by some sort of attack. And for that reason, Shadowhunter is quite easy to play in this regard. As a con for this class, one of the build paths that is very powerful for Deathblade disables the demon form entirely and choosing to make your human form abilities more powerful. This is a personal note, but I feel like this is a bit of a shame. It's kind of taking the class's identity away from it in order to give it a statistical buff, which I feel like is maybe not the most interesting design overall, and you might find that this is a little bit of a shame. It's a bit of a depressing note if you decide to be a Shadowhunter only to realize that the meta spec is to not even have your demon form be viable at all. Another thing that's a con for this is that outside of the demon form, a little bit like the Berserker actually, your cooldowns can be a little bit on the longer and slower to recharge side. So a little bit like the Berserker, it has a bit of a kind of boom and bust period sometimes where you go into your demon form and you get all fast and edgy and cool, and then it's a little bit slower when you're not in demon form. But overall, this is a really cool class with a lot to offer. It was the queen of DPS in Season 1 for the game. They have nerfed it a little bit since then, but it's still considered a pretty good class to go. Then moving on to the Deathblade. The Deathblade, like I said before, has more of a kind of duelist vibe to it. One of the pros for this class is, once again, your skills are very flashy and cool. You're also very good at PvP. I know that this video is mostly based on PvE, but if you do also want to be good at PvE and PvP, then you might want to consider making Deathblade your main. It's also a very easy class to learn and play. You do really good damage, a couple of positionals from the back, all things considered, but overall it does a lot of damage, this class, and it's fairly easy to play. You have these 3 kind of combo points that you gradually drain in order to use abilities. It's overall a very simple class to learn and pick up, and it looks really cool and it does good damage, so that might be your kind of thing. On the minus side for this class, however, like I just said, it does have back attacks. Positioning is very key for this class, so if you don't like positional abilities, do not pick Deathblade, because a lot of your damage comes from being able to go behind the mob. Although one of the pros that the Deathblade can offer you is that it does have the ability to dodge through the monster that you're fighting to end up behind it in order to be able to do these abilities. Another con of this class is that it is really quite gear intensive, actually. It has a very kind of awkward early game where in order to really shine, you need to get 3 of your engravings up to like a certain standard. However, you won't really be able to do this very early on in terms of gear, and you might find that the class has this kind of awkward early transition period until you're able to do that with your gearing up. So you will find that perhaps Deathblade is a little bit more expensive if you choose to do it as an all aura main at first until you get your gear to the standard, and that is something to bear in mind. You might not be doing as much damage as other people until you have these engravings fully set up. Phew, alright, we managed to do it. Those are the 15 classes coming to Lost Ark when the game launches very soon, and I hope this video has been beneficial in helping you make your mind up. If the video has helped you decide on a class, do leave a comment below. Or maybe since the dawn of civilization, you came out into this world and you were like, I just want to be a scrapper. I know I'm going to be a scrapper main when the game comes out. Why are you even asking? If that's you, also feel free to leave a comment below. It would be nice to see some of you guys getting excited for the game as much as I am, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of my Lost Ark adventures with you guys as the game comes out. Also, a big thank you once again to my Patreon subscribers. You guys have really helped me kind of stay motivated and stuff, and I'm looking forward to being able to release more videos for you in the future. Thank you so much everybody for watching this video. This has been Sinow. I hope it has been helpful. Take care. Goodbye.